Good morning, everyone. It's Tuesday, May the 19th, and I am re-recording the session that we shared together last night on Monday night on the world of the New Testament. I did not manage to record the session well last night, and so I'm re-recording it this morning, and I hope it'll benefit those who weren't able to attend last night, and maybe even some of those who did attend. If you want to watch it again, you'll probably hear me say some things that I did not say last night, but that might be a benefit to you. So I'm going to begin sharing my screen with you now, and we'll get started. So we're talking in our course about the world of the New Testament. And as we get started this evening on talking some more about the world of the New Testament, I wanted to get an opportunity to say something to you in terms of a look back at where we've been so far. I'm going to do a really short review of where we've been so far in our course. Last week, Bill Kettering talked with you about part of the world behind the text, the cultural part that forms part of the context. And that word context literally means something you read or understand together with. That's what con means in Latin, together with. Something you read or understand together with the text to give it more meaning. That's what the word context indicates. And Bill showed us how that's true in terms of some of the major political parts of first century Jewish culture. He talked to us about the king, Herod, about the ruling council of elders, the Sanhedrin, and about the judges, who could be the Sanhedrin, could be the Herodian king, could be the Roman procurator. And in the case of Jesus' trial in the New Testament, as Bill said, all three of those judges get involved in Jesus' trial. The week before, Bill, Tyler talked with all of us about a different part of the world behind the text, the historical part. He gave you an overview of 400 years of intertestamental history and four major periods of Jewish history that fit into those 400 years. The Persian period, the Greek period, the period of Jewish independence, that brief period of just over 100 years when Jewish self-rule was in effect in Israel. And finally, the Roman period. And Tyler also talked about some of the major historical events that helped shape the development of Jewish culture in each of those four periods. The week before that, I led off our course on the world of the New Testament by introducing you to the idea of the three worlds of the text: the world behind the text, the world inside the text, and the world in front of the text. I also told you that in this 6-week class, we were going to be focusing on the world behind the text, and I tried to give you some examples of how doing that could help you or anyone understand the meaning of the text more completely. So that's a look back at where we've been so far. Next, where are we going tonight? Well, tonight I'm going to be talking with you about another part of the world behind the text, another part of the cultural context of the New Testament. Bill talked politics. Tyler talked history. I'm going to talk about books, because books form a large part of any culture, and books and fragments and scrolls and notes and all kind of writings have come to us out of the intertestamental period and the first century. And I'm going to use the word books tonight in this talk to indicate any of those kinds of writings for the most part. So before I move on, let me say a few words to you about the benefit of knowing something concerning intertestamental and first century books. There are two primary paths we can take to study and learn more about the culture of groups of people in ancient history. The first path involves the discovery and the study of the physical remains of a culture. Archaeology does that study and that process of discovery. Archaeology seeks to find the physical remains ancient peoples left behind, remains of buildings or remains of art, or inscriptions or whatever else archaeology can find. The second path involves the discovery of the literary remains of a culture. That comes from reading and deciphering and studying those remains in those books or scrolls or fragmentary papyri and any other kinds of literary remains we can find in writing that come from the intertestamental period and the first century. So tonight I want to try and sketch out, and I do mean sketch out, the scope and the contents of the literary remains that have come to us out of the intertestamental period and the first century. I'm going to do that because the books that come from those periods are the ones the writers of the New Testament were most likely to be influenced by, most likely to know at least a bit of. But when I say that, remember what you've learned so far about Jewish culture in the intertestamental and the period in the first century. Jewish culture did not exist in a vacuum all by itself without being influenced by other cultures. It was part of a cultural mix, a diverse cultural mix of Jewish and Gentile influences. So in terms of literature, that means primarily Persian and Greek and Roman writings, which could be about history or biography or what we would call today historical fiction, but is probably better named legends. There were novels in this period. There were romance novels written in this period, poetry written, philosophy written, religious writings come out of this period. It's all part of the cultural background of the New Testament, the literary part of the cultural background of the New Testament, to some extent. What do I mean by those last three words, to some extent? Well, what I'm trying to do is let you know that extent of influence is what scholars of the New Testament talk about and write about and sometimes disagree about and even sometimes argue about. Why? Well, because sometimes the extent of influence is very clear, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes influence seems possible, and sometimes influence seems probable. And now that all of you are becoming students of the intertestamental and New Testament periods, you just need to know that. But to get back to my point, I was telling you that Persian, Greek, and Roman literature influences Jewish literature, and it certainly does. One of the ways that shows up very clearly is in the way that Jewish writers react positively and negatively to Gentile influence in their writings. Some writers, some Jewish writers like this fellow whose name is Philo, we're going to talk more about Philo in a minute. Some writers like Philo lived among Greeks and Romans and Egyptians in the very cosmopolitan city of Alexandria. There was a large community of the Jewish diaspora, the Jewish people who lived outside of the land of Israel, living in Alexandria. And as you'll see, Philo was a part of that community, and he welcomed the opportunity to interact with other cultures around him, appreciating their wisdom and trying to demonstrate to them the virtues of Judaism and the values that Jewish people and Gentile people shared. Other writers, like the teacher of righteousness who lived in this place, this is a picture of the ruins at Khirbet Qumran. The teacher of righteousness and the Essene community at Qumran and in other places had a collection of writings, and those collections indicate very clearly that the Essenes, and particularly the teacher of righteousness, wanted nothing to do with what was called the yoke of the Gentiles and its cultural influences on Judaism. So there are the two extremes, and there are lots of in-betweens too from Jewish writers whose books stand in between the teacher of righteousness on one side and Philo on the other side. Something else to say as we get started tonight. I'm going to talk with you almost exclusively about Jewish literature, There is a lot of it, as you will see. Some of it began as words spoken or heard that were later written down. Some of it probably was written down first and then was talked about, discussed in conversations. But we're not going to consider the process that produced it very much tonight. We will say a little bit about that, but not much. Instead, what I'm going to do is sketch out for you, as I said, an overview of the scope and the contents of Jewish literature. And if you want to get more than a sketch, I'm going to recommend two books to you, and they're going to be on the slides that you'll find on the CKPC website under our class. And let me show you those two books right now. The first book is written by George Nicholsburg. It's called Jewish Literature Between the Bible and the Mishnah. And what George means by Bible is the last book of the Bible that we call the last book of the Old Testament, which is the book of Malachi. And the Mishnah is a collection of rabbinical Jewish writings that comes from around the year 200. It is a collection from earlier periods, but it gets put together around the year 200 or something like that. So now let's take a look at the second book that you might want to see. This book is written by Craig Evans. It's called Ancient Texts for New Testament Studies, a guide to the background literature. And as you can see on this slide, there is a lot of literature, and Craig does a great job, as does George Nicholsburg, of guiding you through that literature, helping you understand where it comes in terms of the history of the intertestamental period and the first century, and helping you understand something about its scope and its contents. I'm going to do a much briefer survey than either Nicholsburg or Evans' books do, but I'm going to go ahead and get started now talking to you about 6 major collections of Jewish literature. 6 major collections, 6 libraries of Jewish literature. The first one of those collections is called the apocrypha. The word apocrypha means taken out of hiding, and I'm going to explain why that word was chosen for these books a little bit later on when we talk more about the apocrypha, after we've had a chance to survey all 6 of the major collections of Jewish literature. But the apocrypha is a little library. It contains 12 to 18 books, depending on who's counting. And by that, I mean that Roman Catholics generally accept 12 books in their version of the apocrypha, and other parts of the worldwide Christian church, including the Orthodox churches in Greece and in Russia, and the Coptic church in Egypt, accept a different number of books. So the apocrypha contains 12 to 18 books, depending on who's counting. What kinds of books do you find in the apocrypha? Well, here's a quick sketch of what kind of books are in the apocrypha. First and Second Maccabees are historical books that describe, in the way that ancient history describes, the Jewish revolt against the Syrian Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And their history contains both fact and legend, but it was ancient history they were writing, not modern history. There are books which supplement the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. First Esdras provides another account of the events that happened after the return from exile that are described in your Old Testament, my Old Testament, in 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. There are books more like what we would call today legends, or maybe works of historical fiction. These are books like Tobit and Judith, Susanna, and Bel and the Dragon. And you can see as I talk about those titles that some of them would probably tend to be what we would call historical fiction, and some of them tend to be more what we would call legends today. There are books of teaching or instruction, like the teaching or instructions that you find in the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, or the book of Ecclesiastes. These are called in the Apocrypha the Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus, or the Wisdom of Ben Sira, who's the writer. There are devotional or liturgical books, the Prayer of Manasseh, the Prayer of Azariah. There's a song, the Song of the Three Young Men. And there's even a psalm, Psalm 151, in some versions of the Apocrypha. There are letters in the Apocrypha, like the letter of Jeremiah. And there's an apocalyptic book, 2nd Esdras, apocalyptic like the book of Revelation, a book that intends to describe how God is going to bring the current world to an end, judge unrighteousness, and reward his righteous people. So why are these books important? Well, for one thing, they all come from the latter half of the intertestamental period, and they all predate the New Testament, except for parts of 2nd Esdras. Second, they help us understand the world behind the text of the New Testament, the world out of which the New Testament developed. And they influence the New Testament in subtle but still significant ways. What do you mean by that, Jim? How? Well, primarily in two ways. Through allusions, and those allusions sometimes get very close to a quotation, but not quite a quotation, and that's called a citation. So sometimes the works of the Apocrypha influence New Testament writers through allusion, and there is at least one citation found in the book of Jude. In the 14th and 15th verses of Jude, you find words that are very close to a quotation of words from the book of Enoch and that apocalyptic work, or Esdras, as it's sometimes called. The second way that the Apocrypha influences the New Testament writers is in terms of recurring ideas and themes. Ideas that are talked about in the Apocrypha are also talked about in the New Testament in different ways, but in ways that indicate that both the Apocrypha and the New Testament are thinking along the same lines, even if they think differently. Now, when I say the Apocrypha, I need to tell you something more about it. The Apocrypha indicates that Jewish authors in the intertestamental period felt free, in one sense at least, to use the materials of the Hebrew Bible that were developing, that were not yet a canonical collection, although there's good evidence that the law of Moses, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the work of the prophets in some quarters of Judaism were already considered like a canon, a collection of books that were considered special and specially inspired by God's Spirit. But there were Jewish authors in the intertestamental period and in the first century and in the centuries after the first century for some time that felt that they were called to interpret, to imitate, and to supplement the more authoritative works that were in the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. And when I say in one sense they felt free to do that, this is the important thing to remember. So tie this around the string of your finger when you think about any of these Jewish collections of literature that we're going to talk about tonight that do this kind of interpretation and imitation and supplementation of material from the Hebrew Bible. In all the places where the influence of the Apocrypha shows up in the New Testament, or the influence of any other kind of Jewish literature, it is never given the kind of authoritative introduction that is given to quotations from the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. For example, Old Testament materials in the New Testament are often introduced with words like, "this took place in order to fulfill," or "all this took place in order to fulfill the words of," and then a direct attribution will be made to a book or an author in the Hebrew Bible. And you just don't find that kind of thing happening when material from the Apocrypha is clearly in the mind of a New Testament writer, or where there's an allusion in the New Testament to something in the Apocrypha. I'm going to say more about that and about why the Apocrypha is not used in the same way as the Hebrew Bible, why, in fact, it is in some modern Bibles, but it is called deuterocanonical material. I'm going to say more about that a little bit later. And when I do, I'll also tell you why the Apocrypha is included in some Christian Bibles and not in others. But for now, let me go on. We've talked about the first major collection of Jewish literature, the Apocrypha. Now let's go on and talk about the second major library, major collection of Jewish literature, the pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha means falsely attributed. And these writings are falsely attributed in our minds to major figures of the Old Testament, figures that stood in Jewish history behind the intertestamental period. And we might say that the writers of the books of the pseudepigrapha were using pen names. They did not understand themselves to be writing things that were false. They understood themselves to be writing in the name of famous people from Jewish history and saying things to their generation, to the people they were writing to in the intertestamental periods, saying things in the names of people like Moses or Isaiah or Jeremiah, saying things in the names of these prophets that the writers of the pseudepigrapha felt were consistent with their material from within the Hebrew Bible, but which these authors might say to people if they were living not in the history in the past, but in the history in the intertestamental period. There are many more books in the pseudepigrapha than there are in the apocrypha. There are more than 60 books in the pseudepigrapha, and depending on how you count small pieces of books, there may be even up to 100. Most of these books that we call pseudepigrapha predate the New Testament. Some do not. And what you need to know is that there are some that are very short, others that are very long. And there's also a number of ways in which they influence the New Testament. They influence the New Testament through allusions and recurring ideas or themes, like we talked about when we talked about the Apocrypha a minute ago. But there's also one clear citation, and we talked about that. This is in 1st Enoch in Jude 14 and 15. And Jude says, "It was also about these that Enoch, in the 7th generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, See, the Lord is coming with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict everyone of all the deeds of ungodliness." Now, those words are very much like the words of 1st Enoch in the pseudepigrapha or in the apocrypha, depending on what books you put in the apocrypha. Very much like the words of 1st Enoch, but not quite a direct quotation. And in Jude, and remember that Jude is one of the 2 books in the New Testament written by, at least traditionally attributed to 2 of the half-brothers of Jesus. James is one, Jude is the other. Jude is primarily a work encouraging people to repent of ungodliness, so it's natural he would want to include a quotation like the one that I just read to you, rather a citation. I shouldn't call it a quotation. It is not a direct quotation. It's not a word-for-word quote, but it is a citation. It uses many of the words that are found in Enoch, but in different places, and kind of strings them together so that you get an idea that Jude thinks that Enoch, something that someone in the intertestamental period wrote in the name of Enoch, a character from the book of Genesis, sounds very much to Jude like it's consistent with the teaching of Jesus concerning the second coming and the teaching of Paul concerning the second coming, if Jude is written after the Pauline epistles. The real value of the pseudepigrapha is the same as the apocrypha, but the pseudepigrapha shows us, in addition to that, a really wider variety of ways that Jewish culture responded to the yoke of the Gentiles. The pseudepigrapha expands our understanding of the nature and the diversity of literary genres, like apocalyptic literature, for example. So we've talked about 2 collections of Jewish literature so far, the apocrypha and the pseudepigrapha. Let's talk now about a 3rd collection of Jewish writings, Jewish literature, Jewish books. These are called the DSS, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Qumran Scrolls. Both of those titles indicate where the scrolls were discovered geographically. They were discovered at a place called Khirbet, which is an Aramaic word which means hill with caves. They were discovered at Khirbet, Qumran. The story of the discovery is interesting. In the post-World War II period, early in that period, a Jewish shepherd boy and his friend were shepherding sheep and goats. And some of them had strayed up near some caves on a hillside. And in order to try to get them to come back down, the boys began throwing stones, and the stones bounced off the rocks, and they made one kind of sound, but one stone went into a cave, and it sounded like it cracked a bowl or a piece of pottery. And so the boys scrambled up into the caves, and they discovered the first of what later became more than 800 books and fragments of books. When I say books, remember primarily scrolls and papyri, but 800 of these. And one of the really important things about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they are all written in Hebrew or Aramaic. They had been hidden in these caves by the Essenes, a group that you'll hear more about next week from Tyler. They had been hidden during the time of the First Jewish War, which began in 66 AD. And incidentally, that number 66 AD and the Jewish War that took place in 66 AD may connect with some of the writings and some of the visions that John has in the book of Revelation, and even with the number 666, in a way kind of like Jesus speaks about the need to forgive 70 sins 70 times 7. The number 66 AD became ingrained in Jewish minds for the terrible destruction of the temple, and that may account for the number 666 in Revelation, but there are other ways of understanding that number as well in terms of things that were happening in the Roman Empire and who was the Roman emperor as well. Anyway, like I said, one of the really important things is that they're all written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and they can all be reliably dated from around. That's what the C with the period stands for. It stands for a Latin word circa, which means around. They all are written from around the date 168 BC to 70 AD when the Jewish War ended. And during the Jewish War, the community at Qumran was extinguished by the Romans. The scrolls contain all kinds of literature. For example, the Isaiah scroll contains the entire book of Isaiah. And if you go to Jerusalem, you will see a large building and you'll think that is a concrete sculpture of a scroll. But it is a building that contains the entire book of Isaiah, written sometime during those years between 168 BC to 70 AD, copied down in one form by a scribe in the community of the Essenes at Qumran. The entire book of Isaiah. And you'll also find in the Qumran literature, apocalyptic literature, community rule that helps you picture community life, how the Essenes viewed other groups and the community's take on how God would end the world and judge all its peoples, and apocalyptic, a couple of books of apocalyptic. How does all this influence the New Testament? It helps us understand the world of the New Testament, and it influences the writers of the New Testament, again, through allusions and recurring themes or ideas that are echoed in the New Testament. And maybe, just maybe, there's a link between the Qumran community and the work of John the Baptist. Some New Testament scholars believe, and there is some evidence, that could link John the Baptist to the Qumran community in terms of the way he dressed and the content of his preaching and his vision of a coming Messiah and his need to baptize people to prepare for the coming of that Messiah. So there may be a link between the Qumran community and John the Baptist. The apocrypha, the pseudepigrapha, the Qumran scrolls, those are the first three major collections of Jewish literature. Let's talk now about a fourth major collection of Jewish literature. These are the works of Philo Judaeus, or Philo of Alexandria. Philo is born around 15, or between the years 15 and 10 BC. This is during the reign of Herod the Great. And those years actually make Philo a rough contemporary of Jesus. But Philo's life was very different than Jesus's life. For one thing, Philo lived and wrote in the Jewish diaspora in Alexandria in Egypt, which was a very cosmopolitan city where Judaism and Greek culture and Roman culture and Egyptian culture intermingled and interacted freely and respectfully. For another, his family had both status and wealth. Philo was a prolific author, and he wrote at least 35 books, many of them essays, interpreting the Old Testament scriptures, using allegory to demonstrate the parallels between the Old Testament and Greco-Roman philosophy. Philo is trying in his books to explain Judaism in almost everything he writes in a way that will make it understandable and attractive as a kind of philosophy, as a kind of religion, as a way of life to Greeks and Romans and Egyptians. Philo's influence on the New Testament is less than the collections we've talked about so far, the apocrypha, the pseudepigrapha, and the writings of Qumran. But Philo's allegorical approach to the interpretation of the Old Testament is also found at least once in Paul's writings, and probably more, but at least once very clearly in the allegory that you find in Galatians chapter 4, where Hagar, the wife that Sarah gives to Abraham when Sarah cannot conceive. You remember the story. Sarah gives her handmaiden, Hagar, to Abraham, and Abraham goes into Hagar so that his line can be continued. Hagar has a son, but she remains a slave woman, and Sarai finally gets so jealous of Hagar that she makes Abraham cast Hagar out. And so in Paul's allegory, Paul is trying to talk about the way in which Christianity has superseded the laws of Judaism. And so he tells the Galatians that this is like Hagar and Sarah. And the children of Sarah are the children of the promise, the children of Christ. And the children of Hagar are still the children of the law. And so the children of Sarah are the children of the fulfilled covenant. And the children of Hagar are the children who have not been cast out, but put in second place, because now the Messiah has come. And the covenant that God makes with Israel has been fully implemented, fully fulfilled in the perfect life of Jesus, his perfect obedience to the Old Testament law, his sacrificial death for us, and his resurrection in God's power. So these are the works of Philo Josephus, and his importance is primarily in terms of his allegorical approach to the interpretation of the Old Testament. Let's talk about a fifth collection of writings. These are the books that come from the pen of Flavius Josephus. That was his Roman name, or Josephus ben Matthias. When you see the word ben in a name, it means the son of in Aramaic. And Josephus was the son of a man named Matthias. Josephus is born around 37 or 38 AD, during the time of the reign of the Roman Emperor Caligula. His father came from a priestly family, and his mother claimed royal descent. And this gave Josephus both status and a very bright mind. And as a young man, he studied Jewish law, and he thought of becoming a Sadducee, he thought of becoming a Pharisee, he thought of becoming a Essene, and he even traveled to Rome. He lived in each of those communities as a student of Jewish law, the Pharisees, in the Sadducean community, and his family may well have come from a Sadducean family. He lived among the Essenes for a while, and he lived in Rome for a while. When the first Jewish war against Rome began in 66 AD, Josephus became a commander in Galilee. But after his forces were surrounded, he surrendered, and he told the Roman general Vespasian that Vespasian would someday be an emperor. He had seen it in a dream. Josephus' life was spared for that dream, but he was imprisoned until his words came true, and then he was released. And he wrote two historical books of history. One was about the Jewish war, and the other was about what he called Jewish antiquities, which is really a story of the Old Testament told in narrative form. Josephus also wrote an autobiography about his life, and he wrote a defense of Judaism against Gentile accusers. What did the Gentiles accuse Judaism of? Primarily of being a monotheistic religion. All other religions in the first century were polytheistic. That means that they worshiped one or more gods, but they did not worship, even if they worshiped one God, they did not worship that God exclusively. Judaism was a monotheistic religion. It worshiped God exclusively. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one God. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. These are the words in Deuteronomy, the words of the Torah, the words of Moses. Judaism was a monotheistic religion, and Gentiles thought that was very, I can't think of a better word than selfish, very self-centered, very not tolerant in the way that Romans expected the peoples they governed to be tolerant of other religions. So those are the works of Josephus. Let's talk now about the last collection of Jewish literature. Before we do, let's name the first five. There was the apocrypha. There was the pseudepigrapha. There were the works of Philo. There were the works of Josephus. There were the Qumran scrolls. Now we're going to talk about the sixth major collection, and by far the biggest collection of Jewish literature. And this collection is known as the Targums and the early rabbinical literature. Pardon me. Let's talk first about the Targums. The Targums were Aramaic paraphrases of what we would call the Old Testament, what they would have called the Hebrew Bible in its developing form. The Hebrew Bible was not yet a full collection, but as I said before, the law and the prophets, if you came from a Pharisaic rabbinic tradition, were considered by the year 200 as books that they said defiled the hands, holy books. The books that were still under debate and continued to be in debate for some time in Judaism were the books that we call the writings today. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, the writings. But Sadducees and Pharisees and almost all Jews would have considered the Torah authoritative, and they would have known about the 5 books of Moses, and the books of the prophets also would have been widely known and talked about, because in the synagogues of this time, the law and the prophets were read. We know this, for example, because of the beginning of Luke, where Jesus is called upon to read in the synagogue, and there's handed to him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. These Targums, these Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible, originate primarily in the synagogues. How early is a matter of discussion among scholars. All scholars, however, agree that some of the Targums certainly come from the first century, and they are relevant to our understanding and to the wording of some New Testament texts that cite the Old Testament or quote the Old Testament in a paraphrastic form. It's kind of the way in which English Bible translations differ as you move from one translation to another. Some phrase things differently. Some Bibles, like the Message or the New Living Bible, are more paraphrastic. Even the Common English Bible is more paraphrastic than a literal word-for-word translation. And paraphrastic translations are not trying to translate one Hebrew word into one English word in the Old Testament. They're trying to take the idea that's conveyed by the Hebrew words and translate that idea as English words would phrase it. That's why they're called paraphrases. These Aramaic paraphrases indicate that Aramaic was the common language in Israel in the first century. And so many times in the synagogue, the Hebrew would be read, and then it would be paraphrased in Aramaic in kind of a homily, kind of, again, what Jesus does in Luke chapter 4. But he doesn't get a chance to move through the whole of the homily because, as you remember, the people take umbrage at the fact that they know his family and where he comes from, and how does he think he gets off translating and dealing and interpreting the Isaiah scroll as he begins to do. So they take him outside the city and they try to cast him off a cliff, but he walks through the middle of them and walks away. Let's talk about the second part of this big collection of literature called the Targums and Early Rabbinical Literature. Let's talk about the rabbinical literature part. How can we define rabbinical literature? Well, that's a real difficult thing to do in a short amount of time, but let's try this definition. Rabbinical literature is a collection of comments made by the Hakamim. These are Pharisaic rabbis, and they comment on words of the Torah. These comments are collected around the year 200 in a Jewish collection that still is in existence today, a book called the Mishnah. And they comment on the other books of what we would call the Old Testament, what then was called the Hebrew Bible or the developing Hebrew Bible. And those books include the books of the prophets and the writings. And commentary on those books is called Midrash. So Mishnah is commentary on the 5 books of the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And Midrash is comment on the prophetic books and the writings. The dates of these comments are between the 1st century and maybe even some pre-1st century and the 6th century AD. Most of them are written after the New Testament, but parts of this material, the early parts, like the teaching of the elders, or what's called Pirkei Avot, predate the 1st century, or at least date in the 1st century. And so they are very important indeed. Besides the Mishnah, there is the Jerusalem Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, the Tosefta, and the Gemara. All of these are libraries in and of themselves, collections of books that run into volumes of published books today. Those are the early rabbinical writings. That's what's known as early rabbinical literature. So we've talked now about all 6 of the collections of early Jewish literature, and we're all done, right? No, wait, there's more. There are all kinds of things that weren't really parts of big collections of Jewish literature, but are part of Jewish literature when you look at Jewish culture in the intertestamental period and the 1st century. For example, there are medical texts, there are magical texts, there are mystery texts, there are texts written about those mystery religions of Egypt. There are mythical texts, and that's just the M's in terms of literature from the intertestamental period and the 1st century that's not found in any of the 6 major collections of Jewish literature that I've talked to you about, nor is it found in the New Testament. But I've tried to give you enough to give you a sketch, a simple outline of the major collections of Jewish literature. And now, before I go on a little bit, let me tell you a story. This man is my doctoral mentor. This is Dr. James Dunn. Jimmy, as he encouraged me to call him. He never stood on his title or on the fact that he was already a published author of 3 books by the time that I studied with him. I was his 3rd doctoral student in a career that eventually led him to become the Lightfoot Professor of New Testament at Durham, a very prestigious New Testament position in England, and the author of more than 40 books. But when I went in to see him, on the first time I met him in his office was full of books, bookcases on 2 sides, a window and a desk on one end, a door on the other end, a table in the middle, a large table piled high with books. And he sat back in his desk chair, asked me to take a seat in another chair by his desk, and said, "Tell me again what it is that you would like to study, what you would like to write your doctoral dissertation, what's called in England a thesis, what you would like to write your thesis about." And I told him, "Well, Dr. Dunn, I've really come over because I have enjoyed what you've written so far about Paul and John and the Holy Spirit. I would like to study the connection between wisdom and spirit. And in particular, I'd like to study it in terms of Paul's understanding of the connection in 1 Corinthians 2, where he talks about the Spirit of God giving us wisdom from the mind of God. And I'd like to study it in terms of what John talks about in the farewell discourse in John 14 through 16, where Jesus in the Gospel of John talks about the Spirit bringing us understanding of what he has taught. And Jimmy Dunn, who was a Scot in terms of his ethnic background, said with just a bit of a brogue, all right, let's start by having you look for wisdom and spirit in the Jewish stuff, in the apocrypha, Ecclesiasticus, and the wisdom of Solomon. And then we'll go on to the Dead Sea Scrolls and Philo. Let's have you write a paper about each of those. And then we'll go on and move back to Paul and John. Well, that answered one question in my mind, and the question was, where was I going to start on my thesis? But it did not answer another question that popped into my mind immediately when I heard Jimmy say those words. And that question was, why? I need to be honest with you. I didn't ask that question, but I was thinking it. Why would I want to start with the Apocrypha? Why would I want to read Ecclesiasticus or the Wisdom of Solomon? Why would I want to go on to the Dead Sea Scrolls or Philo? Those are works that are not in the New Testament, and I came here to do a New Testament thesis with you. I know that's how I was feeling. I know it's how a lot of people feel about these collections of Jewish literature that I've been speaking to you about tonight. Because, well, frankly, they're not in our Bibles. So why is that? To answer that question, I want to finish up tonight by talking to you about the Apocrypha and about why the books of the Apocrypha are found in some Christian Bibles, but not in others. So first of all, again, a word about this title for the books where I was going to start studying, the Apocrypha. Where does that come from? That's what I want to talk to you again about and remind you of what I said. And then why are these books in some Bibles, but not in my Bible or your Bible? It all has to do with Greek in a lot of ways. And maybe you recognize this fellow if you have seen the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding. But I'm going to encourage you to take the website that you find there and plug it into your browser and watch a 30-second video clip of one of my favorite characters in this movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. This is Mr. Portcullis. And Mr. Portcullis is convinced and tells his family and other people often, to the great dismay of his teenage daughter, that every word in English comes from a Greek word. And so once again, let's take a look at this Greek word, apocrypha, and ask the question that I didn't ask earlier. Where was the Apocrypha hiding? Well, the word Apocrypha is doubly blessed because it comes from two Greek words. Apo, A-P-O in Greek means out of, and krypto comes from a Greek verb that means to hide. So apokrypto means to take out of hiding. These books that ended up in the Apocrypha, where were they hiding? Well, the truth is they weren't hiding. They were in plain view in the intertestamental period and in the New Testament period. Any literate Jew, like Philo or Josephus, for example, would know about them and have read some of the books of the Apocrypha in all likelihood. But scholars estimate the rate of literacy in Israel was probably less than 10%. So many would not know about the books of the Apocrypha because they had read them, but many people would have probably heard about some of their ideas, maybe heard some of their words, or a paraphrase, a line or two that someone remembered who had read them, or had heard had a conversation with someone who had read them. That's probably why the New Testament so often is influenced by the apocrypha in these two exact ways. The ideas contained in the apocryphal books were certainly in the air of conversation in the first century, kind of like hearing about a sermon that Tyler preached a couple of weeks ago that you missed hearing in person. But in a conversation with somebody else, they told you something about it. There is, however, one important thing to remember. These books of the Apocrypha were never read alongside the law or the prophets in the synagogues, as far as we know. The rabbis may have commented on them, and as rabbinical literature may sometimes reflect. But for Protestants like us, these books of the Apocrypha were and still are hiding from our Bibles, because the canon of the Hebrew Bible, as developed, never included in its final form the books of the Apocrypha. So at the time of the Reformation, Protestants chose the 39 books in the Hebrew Bible and rejected the deuterocanonical books that by then were in Catholic Bibles. That is the short answer, but there is a backstory, a bigger backstory. I can't tell you all of it tonight, but I do want to tell you part of it because I know that many of you are interested in the question of why aren't the books of the Apocrypha in my Bible? Well, here's the reason. It has to do with something called canon. First of all, you need to know that all Protestants, all Roman Catholics, all Orthodox, all Coptic Christians all agree 27 books belong in the canon of the New Testament. And canon is another word, as Mr. Portcullis would tell you, that comes into English from a Greek word. The word in Greek means measuring stick. And that word is chosen for this library of 27 books that you and I have, and all Christians have in their New Testament. Because these 27 books measure out and define what Christianity is, what Christians believe, what Christians practice. These 27 books provide the boundaries of orthodoxy and show what kind of diversity exists within Christianity and what kind of unity exists within Christianity, what kinds of beliefs and practices stand outside the boundaries of Orthodox Christianity and are heretical. That's another English word that comes from a Greek word, and the Greek word heresy means different. Heretics taught and wrote things that were different than the orthodoxy reflected by the 27 books of the New Testament. But, and here comes another part of the story, all Roman Catholic Christians, all Orthodox Christians, all Coptic Christians, and even a couple of Protestant Christian denominations, some of the Lutherans and most Anglicans and Episcopalians, include other books alongside the 27 books of the New Testament canon in their Bibles. And they call these books deuterocanonical because they form a kind of a secondary canon. What's a secondary canon? Well, I think Greek Orthodox Christians say it best. They call the deuterocanonical books anagignoskamena. It means things that are known or recognized as worthy to be read. Why did these books get to be worthy to be read to many Christians and not others? Well, basically because the New Testament canon was a category whose boundaries were fluid, with different books being recognized as worthy to be read, as canonical or non-canonical, by different bishops in different parts of the Roman Empire. Until this fellow, whose name is Athanasius, until the Bishop of Alexandria, this man named Athanasius, wrote an Easter letter to churches in and around Alexandria that were under his authority, under his governance. In that letter, Athanasius gave his churches a list of books that he canonized, and he used that word. The list includes exactly the same 39 books that we find in our Old Testament Bibles today as Protestants, and exactly the same 27 books as we find in our New Testaments today as Protestants, Roman Catholics, Orthodox, and Coptic Christians. But Athanasius also included in his canonized book list the books of the apocrypha. That Easter letter was written in 367 AD, and that date is the one that scholars use to begin to talk about a fixed New Testament canon rather than a fluid one. Now, don't get the wrong idea when I say the canon of the New Testament was fluid. As early as the 2nd century and probably around 170 AD, a list of 23 of the 27 books that are now in our New Testament canon was already in circulation in and around Rome and Italy. We have a copy of that list. That list is called the Muratorian Canon, after an Italian scholar named Ludovico Antonio Muratori, who discovered the list in Italy. He discovered it in the 17th century, but as I said, the list goes back into the 2nd century AD. So it's important to know that less than 100 years after the New Testament books were written, most were already recognized as canonical in Italy, and probably more widely. Still, even after Athanasius canonized the apocryphal books, alongside the books of the Old Testament that we know and the New Testament that we know, still after that, there were doubts in various parts of the Roman Empire about books that eventually ended up in the New Testament canon, like Revelation, Hebrews, and James. And there were doubts about whether or not books like the apocrypha should be included, or whether, probably the better way to say it is, whether books in addition to the apocrypha should be included. So in 382 AD, remember Athanasius 367, now we're in 382, a pope in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, a man by the name of Damscus, who is called Pope Damscus I, called an ecumenical council, a council of the bishops from all over the Roman Empire in Rome. And that council ratified, canonized the entire list that Athanasius had first canonized in Alexandria. And after the council, Damscus asked a man named Jerome to make an authorized Latin version of all the books of the Old Testament, New Testament, and Apocrypha, kind of like the authorized version of the Bible that was made by King James, the English version that we call the King James Version. The Pope authorized this version, however, and this Latin translation that was intended to circulate by the Pope throughout the entire Latin-speaking western half of the Roman Empire became known as the Vulgate. The word Vulgate in Latin means common. It was all the books of the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Apocrypha translated into Latin. What you need to know is that the books of the Apocrypha had never before been translated into Latin, the common or vulgar language of Rome and the church in the Western Roman Empire before that time, before that council, before 382. They had always existed instead in the common language of Alexandria and Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire, which was Greek. Now, Jerome made that translation. He translated all the books of the Old Testament, New Testament, and Apocrypha into Latin. But when he did so, he separated the books of the Apocrypha into a third section, at least in his first version of the Vulgate. But later in his life, he revised his translation and included the books of the Apocrypha alongside and immediately after the books of the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. In other words, right after the book of Malachi, he started the first book of the Apocrypha, as though all these books together formed the Old Testament. That led Roman Catholics to consider them, as indeed the Council of Rome had said, as canonical works like the books Genesis through Malachi. That belief continued to exist in Roman Catholicism all the way up until the time of the Reformation, when it was ratified again by the Council of Trent. And so the Latin Vulgate, in the second translated edition of Jerome, remained the official Bible in Roman Catholicism past the time of the Reformation, all the way into the 20th century, all the way until the year 1943, when Pope Pius XII issued an encyclical called Divino Afflante Spiritu that allowed Catholic Bibles to be based on Greek texts as well as Latin texts. But at that same time as the Council of Trent, in the Reformation, the Reformers had already begun to look back behind the Latin translation of the Old and New Testament, back behind that to the Greek versions of the Old and New Testament, which they called the canon of the ancient church and the 39 books of the Hebrew Bible. So the Reformers were looking at the Hebrew Bible as it existed in the time of the Reformation and at the Greek texts of the New Testament. And they made those two together, the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament texts, their canon. But Luther and some Lutherans and Anglicans who became Episcopalians, at least in America they're called Episcopalians, decided to include some of the books or all of the books of the Apocrypha in their Bibles, as the Greek Orthodox do, as books worthy to be read, not as Roman Catholics do, including them as though they were part of the Old Testament, but as Orthodox and Lutherans and Episcopalians do. And we're still talking here at the time of the Reformation, so I really should say did at that time. They were not included in the Bibles of the Reformation, but they were included in some Lutheran and Anglican Bibles after that time. They were set as they had been set originally in a separate section, not as part of the Old Testament, but as a deuterocanonical section of the Bible, books that were worthy to be read. However, the big majority of other churches that emerged in the Reformation, including the Presbyterian Church, first in Geneva with Calvin, and then in other places in the continent, particularly in the Low Countries, Holland and the Netherlands and Belgium, and then finally in Scotland with John Knox in England. Presbyterian churches, Baptist churches, other Protestant churches did not and do not include the Apocrypha books in our Bibles. The Westminster Confession, which is a Presbyterian confession of faith written in the time just emerging out of the English Protestant Reformation, is typical of what it says about the Apocrypha. And this is a picture of the assembly of the Westminster divines who are putting together the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is a direct quotation from the Westminster Confession and what it says about the books of the Apocrypha. I'm quoting: "The books commonly called Apocrypha, not being of divine inspiration, are no part of the canon of the Scripture, and therefore are of no authority in the Church of God, nor to be any otherwise approved or made use of than other human writings." In other words, they can be read, and you might consider them worthy to be read, but as you read them, you need to remember that they are not printed in our Bibles because they are not inspired and considered authoritative in the same way as the 39 books of the Old Testament and the 27 books of the New Testament. The Westminster Confession actually went further and prohibited the reading of the Apocrypha in the context of worship. However, in another part of the Reformed community, in the lowland countries, a document emerged called the Belgic Confession, and the Belgic Confession did permit the reading of the Apocrypha in worship. And the Belgic Confession says this, and I'm quoting: "The church may certainly read these books in worship and learn from them as far as they agree with the canonical books. But these books of the Apocrypha do not have such power and virtue that one could confirm from their testimony any point of faith or of the Christian religion. And that's where I'm going to leave our discussion of Jewish literature in the intertestamental period and the New Testament first century for tonight. If you want to go further, I recommend the two books that I showed you on an earlier slide, and these two websites, earlyjewishwritings.com, which I recommended to you last week, where you'll find most of, or not, shouldn't say most of, some of the early Jewish writings, more than you'll probably know about, and you'll be astounded to see. The translations are not always the best, but they are English translations. They are accessible. They are free. And then another site called www.tories.org/Bible. And that's a site put together that provides you with a further look at intertestamental Jewish literature and the Jewish literature of the first century and early rabbinical Jewish literature. It's put together by a Norwegian biblical scholar. And so I encourage you to take a look at that as well. That's a reputable site that will help you go further if you want to study what we've talked about more this evening on your own. You're welcome, of course, to send me an email question at any time. And my email address is talljimdavis, all one word, no spaces, talljimdavis@gmail.com. Thanks for letting me talk to you this morning again about early Jewish literature and about the cultural background that early Jewish literature provides for the New Testament, part of the world behind the text of the New Testament.